Estamos listos.
¿Empieza? Ya.
Sí.
Ok. Hola, buenos días. Quiero presentarles a la profesora María Pia Paganelli. La profesora es profesora de Economía en Trinity College de Estados Unidos. La profesora Paganelli investiga en las teorías económicas del siglo XVIII, en particular Adam Smith y David Hume. Ella es presidente del International Adam Smith Society desde 2019 y recientemente elegida presidente del History of Economics Society. La profesora Paganelli vino el año pasado a la UDD, en plena pandemia, como profesora visitante a la Facultad de Gobierno, como Fulbright Scholar. Y estamos muy contentos de tenerla de vuelta con menos restricciones sanitarias y que haya vuelto a la UDD. Su charla de hoy es Adam Smith and the Morality of Political Economics, y será en inglés. Después de la charla pueden hacer preguntas levantando la mano o escribiéndolas en el chat. Y ahí vemos cómo, si la hacen despacito en castellano, ella la entiende porque es italiana y creo que va a entender castellano y ella va a responder en inglés. So, welcome back, Maria Pia. We're so happy to have you here, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much again for the introduction, and in particularly for having me back here at UDD. It's a great pleasure for me to be back indeed in less restrained conditions than I was last year. So the work that I will present today is actually the result of some of the work that I have done last year here at UDD. I was asked to give a class in a course that Jorge was having, and it was about complexity and conflict, and I thought, okay, what can I do? Given that I work on Adam Smith, and then I realized, well, Adam Smith talks a lot about complexity and a lot about conflicts. And so this is in part the result of this invitation of teaching one class in Jorge's course. So I'm extremely grateful also for the opportunity that was given, because the results are now under review for a volume on Adam Smith's 300th birthday. So I work mostly on Adam Smith, and Adam Smith is a Scottish philosopher who was born and raised and lived in the 18th century. Is part of a tradition that is generally called Scottish Enlightenment, which includes a variety of figures, intellectuals, from many different disciplines. And Smith himself was teaching moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. He was teaching jurisprudence, which is basically law. He taught the letters, which is literature. But he became famous in his day, and especially after his death, as an economist. In particular, he's considered the father of economics, unofficially at least. And it is considered the father of economics because of one of the books that he published in his lifetime, which is The Wealth of Nations. So what I look at is some of the arguments that Smith offers in The Wealth of Nations with respect of a couple of things that have been attributed to Smith in later years, and in particularly in the 20th century, 20th, 21st century. 21st century maybe a little bit less, simply because there has been a lot of work that tries to dismantle the idea that Smith, as a father of economics, is also the promoter of greed, in the sense that usually economists today think of self-interest as a major motivation for action. And sometimes self-interest is translated into greed. And so often we hear the caricature, and it is a caricature, that greed is good. And because Adam Smith promoted certain aspects of an economic life that are linked to self-interest, he must also have thought that greed is good. And what I would suggest is that greed is not good at all for Adam Smith. The other suggestion that I would like to make is that differently from some approaches of recent economics, which see that there is a trade-off between efficiency and fairness, for Smith, that is not the case. So it is possible to achieve efficient policies. So it is possible to do what is good for the economy in a way that does not imply unfairness or injustices. And as a matter of fact, I would like to show that it is the opposite for Smith, that justice and efficiency go hand in hand. So I'll start by looking at how Smith himself describes his work of the Wealth of Nations. And we are lucky enough that he told us explicitly what he thought his work was about in a letter to Andreas Holt. And he claims that his Wealth of Nations is a very violent attack I have made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. So for the people who think that Adam Smith is this paladin defender of capitalism or free trade or laissez-faire, we have to rethink a little bit about what that actually means, because the way in which he describes it is not a defense of capitalism itself. He never used the word capitalism, by the way, but an attack, a violent attack, a very violent attack against the whole commercial system of Great Britain. So, what does it mean that the Wealth of Nations is a violent attack against the merchants? As I mentioned, the first thing is that there is no trade-off between justice and efficiency, but what is just happens to be efficient, and what is unjust happens to be inefficient. And so we will work through this throughout this time together. But what this is based on is the idea that mercantilists, so the people who favor a special kind of merchants and manufacturers that we're going to talk about in a second, are able to capture the state and are able to achieve violent policies to benefit themselves at the expense of society. So they are actually using not just the treasure of Great Britain, but also the blood of their fellow citizens under the false pretense of enriching the country. These are claims that are indeed very strong attacks against the merchants, so certain kind of merchants, but they're not just based on a strict efficiency ground. They're also based on a moral ground. It is wrong to do it. But the mercantilists for Smith are those kind of people who are actively working to capture the state to achieve benefit for themselves at the expense of everybody else in society. And what are the consequences of their actions? For Smith is that they create an economic system to promote their own interests. And this economic system is the actual British Empire. So that the entire empire in his day was the result of special interest groups, of these special merchants and manufacturers that were able to push certain kind of policies that favor themselves at the expense of the other British citizens. But the claim is a very strong claim because, again, I'm going to repeat this, the entire British Empire is the result of special interest groups, and special interest groups that are based on, or that are created by merchants and manufacturers. So the wealth of nation can be read as a condemnation of state capture by special interest groups. And again, this is grounded on justice, because this is what Smith tells us, that to hurt in any degree the interest of any other order of citizens for no other purpose but to promote that of some other is evidently contrary to justice and equality of treatment, which a sovereign owes to all his subjects. So Smith explicitly tells us that anything that privilege a certain group over another group, and in particular, privilege a group at the expense of another group, is a violation of justice and the equal treatment which a sovereign owes to all its subjects. And this is exactly what merchants and manufacturers are doing. They are seeking privileges for themselves at the expense of other citizens, and therefore they are contrary to justice and the equality of treatment. So why does Smith think, or at least the way in which I'm reading Smith, in my way of reading Smith, thinks that injustice is inefficient? Because the merchants and manufacturers are enriching themselves with blood money. And I'm not saying this lightly, because as I mentioned before, Smith tells us that merchants and manufacturers are enriching themselves with the blood and treasure of their fellow citizens. So it is indeed an enrichment with blood money. People are dying to enrich a few. And you could say, well, but the merchants and manufacturers are just asking for protections, are just asking for achieving higher prices for their own goods. That's true, but that comes at the cost of human life. And it comes at the cost of human life on different levels. A direct cost of human life, meaning that in order to achieve certain kind of privileges and defend certain kind of privileges, wars are called. So again, if the British Empire was built to promote special interest groups, then the British Empire was built also through wars and was defended through wars. Those are people who are dying for the establishment and protection of privileges of a few. In addition to the direct death through war that mercantilists are causing, there's also some indirect death that Smith condemns. First of all, in order to maintain high prices and high profits for the special interest of some merchants and manufacturers, certain kind of policies are put in place so that you would destroy crops to maintain high prices. And you also not directly destroy people, but you keep wages so low that you prevent people from actually reproducing. And so you would have people who, even if they try to have children, those children would be forced to an early death just because they don't have means of supporting them. And so he tells us that in Bengal, for example, you have a country that is extremely fertile, that would be able, without any problems, to support a very large population. But instead, you have hundreds of thousands of people who die of starvation each year due to the policies that are implemented by the East Indian Company, which is one of the monopolies that Smith condemns. Furthermore, even closer to home, you have death that is induced by poverty. And that poverty is a consequence of some of the policies that are put in place to favor special interest groups. High prices are hurting the poor the most because they are the ones that are most vulnerable. And so Smith tells us that even in the highlands of Scotland, it is common for women to have about 20 children, but only a couple of them are able to survive. So a woman would face something like 18 deaths of her own children out of lack of means. And this is in part caused by the high prices that are induced to protect special interest groups. And so yes, it is true that protections and all the protectionist policies that merchants and manufacturers are pushing for and obtaining are inefficient. So they do slow economic growth, but that slow economic growth is retarding opulence, which means that it is maintaining poverty for a longer period of time than needed, and that poverty is a cause of more death. And so the merchants and manufacturers that are engaged in lobbying and special interest group and are able to achieve their privileges are indeed enriching themselves with blood money. So what Smith is telling us is that we need to understand the nature and causes of wealth, because by doing it, we can allow all people the means to survive and the means to live a good life, not just survive. With trade restrictions, what we are going to generate are inefficiencies and injustices. And trade restrictions, basically all of them, according to Smith, derive from the mean rapacity, these are Smith's work, the mean rapacity of merchants and manufacturers. And so what I'm offering here is a public choice reading of The Wealth of Nations, in which Smith offers a very violent attack against the commercial system of Great Britain, because that system is a system that has been captured by a special interest group and cronyism. I will read like a short paragraph from The Wealth of Nations to give you a sense of what Smith is talking about and why I'm offering this interpretation of Smith. The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce, which comes from this order, which is the people who live by profit, which are the merchants and manufacturers, ought always to be listened to with great precaution and ought never to be adopted till after being long and carefully examined, not only with the most scrupulous, but with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same as that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have upon many occasions both deceived and oppressed it. And so you see that rent-seeking for Smith is what causes harm, what causes injustices, and what causes inefficiencies. So greed is not good. It is, again, this is citing Smith, the mean rapacity of monopolizing spirit of merchants and manufacturers who neither are or ought to be the rulers of mankind. And whenever they do capture the state, they do become the ruler of mankind, then we are ruled by mean rapacity. If I may spend another minute or so to just give an overview of how I see Adam Smith, I would see that Adam Smith for his time was a dissenter. It was somebody who would, even if he was a subject of the British Empire, it was somebody who had very radical views for his time. And he was against mercantilist and against monopoly in an age of mercantilism and monopolies. He was against slavery in an age of slavery. He was against the empire and colonialism in an age of empire and colonialism. He was against taxation without representation, against established churches, against endowed universities. But it was suggesting that competition and commerce would be helpful for society, both in terms of increasing the justice of society and increasing the wealth of society. And this is why one way of reading The Wealth of Nations is as a moral defense of commercial societies. And with this, I think I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll leave open to the discussion if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Maria Pia. That was enlightening, for me at least. I didn't know that about Adam Smith. I open the floor for questions and or observations or suggestions, whatever. I'm trying to see if I have anything in the chat. Not so far. So, and Hans, if anybody wants to make a comment or.
We can make a comment verbally?
Yes, of course, Eduardo.
Yeah. Nice to meet you, Professor Paganelli. Really is, for me, I am a teacher of economic teacher, then I am very happy to stay here because it's given an opportunity for us to discuss of the past and the present. Yeah. I want to make a question about the figure of Adam Smith. Do you think really that Adam Smith is real? Is moral analysis is still valid? You think? Really? I want to give you to notice. First, the analyst Smith represents a turn, a brick, yeah, of the thought, the economic thought of le siècle XVIII. Hein? Le siècle XVIII. Vous parlez français? Hein?
I understand it. Yes.
Ah, yeah. Vous préférez l'espagnol?
Spanish is at the moment is easier.
Yeah. But Adam Smith represents a break, a turning in change, but a change that the subjective theory of value for the labor theory of value. It represents is the father of labor theory of value. Then all his analysis is influenced by this break, because Smith, Ricardo, Marx, yeah, fixing a just price, think all the time in the just price. This just price is the price equal to marginal cost. Then from this they adapted this idea, the inefficient. But the other Cantillon, Turgot, le ministre des Finances de Louis XVI, Turgot, et beaucoup d'économistes italiens, hein, thinking another things. The price are, the value of things are only the price of market. Market are market price. They are not inefficient in the price. Yeah. Then, for me, I think that the theory of this theory of labor theory of value, yeah, conclude necessarily and in the idea the inefficient, that the marks are inefficient. Then I don't know if Smith believed really in the markets. He believed in the hand of God. It was because the invisible man was the invisible man of the providence. No,
okay.
The market.
Eduardo, dejemos que conteste.
Yeah.
So if he wants to answer, okay. Thank you, Eduardo.
I try to give the sense of my question.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question, because it's a very important question, and it opens a lot of doors. So let me start from your last point, that yes, Smith does believe in market, and I think that he strongly believes in markets, so much so that any interference with markets done through special interest groups is criticized. So his criticism of mercantilism are based exactly on his belief that markets, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, are able to or allows us to fulfill ourselves. So the markets are not inefficient. Markets are actually able to create the conditions for us to express ourselves in a way that allows us to fulfill all our desires. Yeah, I'm going to explain this a little bit more. So Smith tells us that we desire to be noticed, to be seen, to distinguish ourselves from others. And this desire is a desire to better our condition. And this desire to better our condition is something that comes from our birth and leaves us when we die. So it's something that we always have with us. And in order to better our conditions, we need to be able to do what we think is best for us. And in particular, we need to work and be paid according to the market price. The problem is there are interferences with how much we are paid, because again, the masters, in Smith's language, cartelize and try to reduce wages, or because the merchants and manufacturers cartelize and try to increase prices and reduce wages at the same time. So there are tensions that are brought in the market by state captures. So the market itself is actually an environment that allows for the bettering of our condition if nobody is able to capture state power. But when you do capture state power, then the market is deformed by the rules that privilege some at the expense of others. And therefore, you're going to have these distortions which prevent an equal economic growth, or a more stable economic growth, or a more natural economic growth. Now, the labor theory of value it can be a challenge, but it's not necessarily linked to inefficiency of markets. I think there's something relatively separate. And it is questionable whether Smith himself actually had a labor theory of value like Marx or like Ricardo. So it's more complicated than is often presented. In terms of his moral analysis, whether it is valid today or not, I would say yes, because today they may not necessarily be just merchant and manufacturers that we are talking about. We can talk about other interest groups that are powerful enough to capture the state. But whenever you have interest groups that capture the state, meaning that they are seeking for privileges, they're seeking to better themselves at the expense of others, you are going to see some problems. And so I think the Smith analysis is definitely still valid today, especially whenever you are like in a situation like in Chile today, like you're rewriting the constitution, you're rewriting the rules of the game. And if the rules of the game are not leveling the field, but they're privileging some groups as opposed to, at the expense of others, you're going to have problems. And you're going to have problems not just on an efficiency ground, but you're also going to have some injustices that will emerge because of some is going to be privileged at the expense of others. So I very much thank you for the question, because it was a very good, I very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's very important for us in Chile right now. That was the enlightening part. Camila Bottinger, that she's a professor at the Faculty of Law. She has raised her hand.
Thank you, Denise, and very nice to meet you, Maria Pia. And thank you for this enlightening, like Denise said, conversation. I already had this discussion many years ago with an economist, which said they don't read the moral in Adam Smith. and you're confirming it. So my obvious question, as I'm a professor of environmental and natural resources law, so the attacks on the companies and the private sector here are much of a discussion. My question is, how come Adam Smith has been read in such a different way, in which what we know here, I'm thinking the conversation in Chile is the liberal, laissez-faire endorsement of profit as a purpose of any company or commercial activity, as with no ethical or moral rules. That's the I don't know if the slogan, but that's the general the titular, like we said here, like the title. But have you found in your research the critical literature which may have taken this picky or some concepts of Smith thinking in not an integral way? Like, who read Adam Smith taking some of the concepts but not the whole of them? And I have to ask this in this institution, which promotes liberty, creativity, and responsibility. What I understand is Smith doesn't approve the unjustified improvement of certain groups in behalf of others. But there's a justified improvement, right? If you create something which can make others people better and you can sell it, that there's no moral reproach in that. I'm reading right? So there's a just way of doing it in Smith. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for these questions. I think that if I understand correctly, you are asking two different questions. One is the difference between justified and unjustified improvements, and the other is why is the reading that I'm offering today to you so different from what you're accustomed to hear. I think the two actually go hand in hand. They're not separate questions. They're just two aspects of a similar question. Let me start from the second one first, because I think is easier to answer. For Smith, we are all entitled to the just compensation for our work. And if you are justly paid, you will flourish. Because again, we want to better our condition. The problem becomes under what are the rules of the games that allows you to better your condition, to be paid for the fruits of your labor. And those rules of the games are such that do not give anybody privileges. So everybody is treated the same. And not the law shouldn't favor certain groups at the expense of others. So if you allow the law to be applied equally to all, then you have a natural improvement due to our natural dispositions to better our condition. But if you give privileges to some groups, then you're going to most likely squeeze other groups and therefore reduce the incentives to be productive. So yes, some groups may enrich themselves at the expense of others, and that is what Smith is condemning. But as long as you have a competitive environment in which nobody is privileged, then you will have the conditions for a justified improvement of everybody. So I can enrich myself as long as I don't step on you. And the problem with lobbying and special interest groups is that they enrich themselves at the expense of others. So the answer for Smith is competition. If you have a truly competitive markets, means that nobody has enough power to capture the state. And therefore, you are able to have this environment in which everybody has the opportunity to flourish and to enrich society as a consequence. But it is the competition that generates that part. And the competition that is created through fair rules that do not privilege a group at the expense of others, as I'm saying again. And so when you hear some of some reading was Smith presents a defense of competition, laissez-faire, in that part is true, because he is favoring competition. He wants maybe not laissez-faire as physiocrats, which are the people who gave the name laissez-faire. So it's not like a brutal competition in which I can step on everybody's feet to enrich myself. It is a fair competition in which I am able to enrich myself by following all the rules and not by breaking all the rules. And so he tells us that as in the race for wealth, you can run as fast as you can. All your muscles and nerves can be all tense, and that will be great, and you will achieve the approbation of the people who are looking at you, as long as you don't elbow down your competitors, as long as you don't trap them, as long as you don't damage them, so that you can enrich yourself. Right? Which is exactly the same argument that he uses to condemn special interest groups, because that's exactly what they do. They benefit themselves at the expense of others. Now, why the moral connotation of this argument is often taken out? Because economists, at least until throughout the 20th century, let's put it like this. Now I think that we're getting a little bit more comfortable with crossing boundaries. We're not accustomed to handle normative claims. So economic as a science is something that's like, if you don't tell me how to handle morality, I don't know how to handle it, and so I'm not gonna deal with it. And so those kind of arguments were pushed aside simply because economists didn't have the tools, or thought that they didn't have the tools to handle it. And I think now we are a little bit more comfortable, or at least like some groups, some economists are a little bit more comfortable with handling border disciplines, and so certain kind of arguments are coming back.
Thank you. I have to make this distinction. In one of the first classes in law school, they teach you the difference between moral and rules. And
meaning
the rules,
that you go ahead.
Yeah. If the rules are the minimum, when you make an enforceable rule in law, sometimes it catches up with some people's moral, or others don't, but you get a minimum. So we are more accustomed to distinguish between the moral and the rule. When you ask a lawyer, what can you do? They tell you what's forbidden and what it's obliged to. But there's a space in between what you've been taught in your house. That's the difference. So I understand that economists look at it like everything's a rule, but not everything is the same type of rule. Maybe that's the gap, or maybe that's why they take some concepts and not the obligations that come with some rights, which we lack in law. You always have to flip coin, right? You have a right, but you have the obligation. And your right ends where the other person, begins. And maybe that's something we have to flip in the economy, but that's a discussion for another time. Thank you very much, Maria Pia.
Thank you.
We have another question from Jose de la Cruz Garrido from the Faculty of Government that you probably have met him. He's a totally fan of Adam Smith.
Well, thank you very much, Denise, for the invitation, and Maria Pia. Well, thank you for your extraordinary paper. From Smith Diagnosis of British Commercial Society, what would be the remedy for state capture? No, that is, how do we regulate, or which are the political system that regulate the incentives in such a way as to minimize the vicious circle between state groups or corporations and politicians or statesmen? Or is something like the tragedy of commercial society? No, that is an endogenous problem. Looking, of course, at the subsequent experience of other countries, Latin America, of course, our experience. So this is my question.
That's a very difficult question for me to answer, and I also think for Smith to answer. So I'll give you my best Smithian answer that I can come up with. I think, in part, the reason why you wrote The Wealth of Nations is to let people know what the merchants are up to. So now you are aware of the fact that there are special interest groups, and you can't hide anymore the fact that they are, so one of I accidentally skipped a slide in the presentation, which is coming up right now. So one of the problems that you have with merchants and state capture is that the interest of the merchant goes against the interest of society. And if that's the only thing that goes on, there's not a big problem. The problem is that the merchants are able to capture the state. And how are they able to capture it? Because of lies. Because they are claiming wrongly that they know how to make the state rich. So they're claiming, make me rich and I'll make the state rich. And that's a lie. But people are willing to believe them, according to Smith, for two reasons. Because they are merchants and manufacturers, so they know how to enrich themselves. And so they think, well, if you know how to be rich, then maybe you know how to make the state rich as well, which is not true. And because we have this natural tendency to admire the rich and powerful. And so we trust them just because they're rich and powerful. And so I think one way is to read The Wealth of Nations as a way of saying, you shouldn't trust the rich and powerful, or at least these kind of rich and powerful, because their interest is not the same interest of the state. And I'm showing you why. So in part, there is this sort of educational purpose, like you tell people like that's not true. It's not true that the interest of the special interests is the same as the interest of the state. They're opposite. And the other remedy that I think Smith sees is competition. If I am small enough, I will not have the power to capture the state. Right? I don't have enough to give. I have nothing to give to the state in exchange for protection. Right? So if you have many merchants and manufacturers that do different things and are not able to collude, then it's much harder to capture the state. So I give you the example of his remedy for, or how he suggests to avoid state capture by the church. Right. So the church is another lobbyist for him, is another special interest group. And the church tries to capture the state by having privileges on the church given by the state, some protection. And again, for the same reason that the merchants do, which is what is good for me, church, is good for the state. So protect me and I'll protect the state. Smith's solution for this is multiplication of sects. If you have, as Smith says, if you have 1,000 different denomination churches, none of them will be able to capture the state because they're too little to capture the state. So competition is part of the key to answer this vicious circle that Smith is describing. And if you have competition, you have also like a virtuous circle, a virtuous spiral, because competition promotes economic growth. And when you have economic growth, it's much harder to cartelize because of the increased competition. So he says, look at the colonies in North America. It is very, very difficult there to cartelize because for oppressing the workers, because there's big economic growth. There's not enough workers to support the growth. And so there is competition among masters to get the workers, as opposed to in Britain, in which there are more workers than needed for economic growth, given the level of economic growth of Britain, and therefore the masters are able to cartelize and oppress the wages. And why is it possible in North America to have that? Again, economic growth and competition. So the two feed on each other, and they're able to break the power of, the potential power of special interest groups.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Mauricio, tienes la mano levantada.
Actually, it's Jorge who wants to have a question.
There you are, Jorge. Okay.
Hi, Maria. Maria,
Hi,
thank you
Jorge.
very much for the presentation. Also for mentioning me. I don't deserve it, but let people believe I do. I have a question for you. In my reading of the paper, I think that you are presenting an optimistic Smith. And I am not sure, actually I want to know what is your evaluation. If he is optimistic, he actually an optimist, or he is a fatalist. And I'm asking this because at the very end of the Wealth of Nations, he basically tells us that all kingdoms, empires, and all kind of government in the human history broke. And because of exactly what you said at the very end, that the universal balance and justice of rulers had no remedy. And the same happens to merchants. So my question is that he is telling us this doesn't have a solution, or he is actually thinking that there is a way?
So I think I don't know the answer, to be honest. So I can tell you both stories, and I'm not sure which one I would pick in terms of Smith's interpretation. So yes, there is an optimistic story in which you can see Smith writing the Wealth of Nations as a way of saying, listen, we need to change, and I'm making this is my part in that change, right? So I'm hoping that by telling you that the king is naked, all of you realize the king is naked indeed, and will able to say with me that the king is naked. So that's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is that it's very difficult to see, and maybe this is it's not necessarily as Smith himself, but I'm looking at where we are today, and where we are today is a very similar place where Smith was 300 years ago or 250 years ago. in the sense that we still have the same rhetorics of merchants and manufacturers, and I'm not saying merchant and manufacturer in sense of the actual merchant and manufacturer, but of special interest groups. And today can be unions just as well as industry, right? So it doesn't quite matter as long as you have like a very powerful lobby that can be a lobby today of workers just as much as a lobby of merchants. But we still have the same rhetoric that Smith is condemning, right? We still have protectionism rhetoric. We still have people who claim to benefit themselves so that the entire country is going to receive benefits. And if you do what is good for me, everybody is going to be good. It's going to be better off. So the rhetoric that we hear today is, in a sense, no different than the rhetoric that we heard from Smith 250 years ago. Is there any betterment? Don't know. Like Smith says that Britain was able to grow despite lobbying and special interest groups. So if you want to push on the optimistic part, it's like, okay, maybe despite lobbying and special interest group, we're still able to grow because our natural tendency to better our condition is strong enough to sort of march through despite all the constraints that we have. On the other hand, you have situations like, in Smith's term, Bengal or China, in which you have an economy that could possibly flourish, that is being devastated by protections, and the protection are causing death in the hundreds of thousands. And you have an economy like China, according to Smith in his time, which was the richest country in the world and has been at the same level of growth as Marco Polo. Why? Because the oppression of the ruling class. So it's quite challenging to see the optimistic part all the way out. But there's also some hope that Smith seems to present to us in the fact that he's describing a situation maybe with the hope that something can be changed. But he tells us explicitly that the hope for free trade in Britain is utopia. So there is a tension, I think. There is like, I really want things to work, but I'm aware of the fact that lobbying and special interest groups are extremely, extremely dangerous.
Thank you, Maria Pia Paganelli. It has been a pleasure. I think we're done with the questions and the time is up. So it has been great to have you here back at the university and with less restrictions. So I hope you enjoy your time here in Santiago.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity, not just to be back, but also to have this conversation with all of you. And I want to thank once again Jorge for lending me his students last semester because it was a great opportunity for me to work on this project.
Okay.
So thank again UDD and everybody who has been involved in having me here both last year
and
Juan Pablo. Absolutely.
Your host.
My host, Juan Pablo, indeed.
Yeah,
so
this will be recorded so you can watch it anytime and at UDD TV YouTube channel. Okay, has been
Thank
recorded.
You.
Okay,
and I will be happy to share the PowerPoint as somebody asked.
Okay, we'll send it to us. Thank you. Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.